Good. Again, I wanted to debrief you on a very comprehensive day of high-level discussions we had today here in Beijing. I met with President Xi, both in a joint meeting with President Emmanuel Macron, and then in a bilateral meeting, and I also had a meeting with Prime Minister Li. So let me start with the EU-China relations. It is an extensive and complex relationship that we have. For both of us, this relationship has a significant impact on our prosperity and our security. For China, because the European Union is the first export destination, while China is in the European Union the third export destination. If I give you one concrete figure, this means trade of more than 2.3 billion euros per day in 2022. At the same time, our trade relationship is increasingly imbalanced. So over the last 10 years, the European Union's trade deficit has more than tripled. It reached almost 400 billion euros last year. And we discussed that because this trajectory is not sustainable and the underlying structural issues need to be addressed. I conveyed that European Union businesses in China are concerned by unfair practices in some sectors, unfair practices that impede their access to the Chinese market. For example, if you take the EU agri-food products, they face significant hurdles. Or if you take medical devices as an example, they are being excluded from the market by discriminatory Buy China policies. All of these sectors I'm speaking about are recognized areas of European excellence. So these sectoral issues are exacerbated by ever-growing requirements imposed by China that apply across the board. Be it, for example, increasing pressure to submit technology transfer, or be it excessive data requirements, or be it insufficient enforcement of intellectual property rights. All this puts European Union companies exporting to China and also those producing in China in a significant disadvantage. We discussed that. And we discussed also the fact that this contrasts with the level playing field that all companies operating in the European single market benefit from. So against this backdrop, the European Union is becoming more and more vigilant about protecting our interests and ensuring a level playing field. In addition to these imbalances in our relationship, as you know, the European Union is growing more vigilant about dependencies. Some of these dependencies raise significant risks for us, as does the export of sensitive emerging technologies. Within this context, we all know that this leads to calls by some to decouple from China. I doubt that this is a viable or desirable strategy. I believe that we have to engage in de-risking. This means focusing on specific risks while appreciating that there is, of course, a large majority of goods and services, so trade, that is unrisky. Of course, different risks required different means to address them. We address the risk of dependencies through the diversification of our trade and investment relations, and the risk of leakage of sensitive technologies that could be used for military purposes needs to be addressed through export controls or investment screening. But whatever the instrument we chose is, we wish to solve the current issues through dialogue. So it's basically de-risking through diplomacy. And this is why I called for, and we agreed in, the resumption of the high-level economic and trade dialogue. I'm very glad that we agreed on this. not only the high-level economic and trade dialogue, but along with this one also the digital high-level dialogue. These two dialogues should convene as soon as possible to make progress on all the different files and produce tangible results. Let me now turn to the geopolitical environment. This visit is taking place in a challenging and increasing volatile context, in particular because of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. China's position on this is crucial for the European Union. As a member of the UN Security Council, there is a big responsibility, and we expect that China will play its role and promote a just peace, one that respects Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, one of the cornerstones of the UN Charter. I did emphasize in our talks today that I stand firmly behind President Zelensky's peace plan. I also welcomed some of the principles that have been put forward by China. This is notably the case on the issue of nuclear safety and risk reduction, and China's statement on the unacceptability of nuclear threats or the use of nuclear weapons. We also count on China not to provide any military equipment directly or indirectly to Russia, because we all know arming the aggressor would be against international law and it would significantly harm our relationship. We also addressed human rights. I expressed our deep concerns about the deterioration of the human rights situation in China. The situation in Xinjiang is particularly concerning. It is important that we continue to discuss these issues, and I therefore welcome that we have already resumed the EU-China human rights dialogue. Besides Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there are some areas of convergence and cooperation on specific global issues. And in view of the size of our economies, we have a shared responsibility in resolving global issues. For example, first and foremost, to promote the climate and to protect the climate and to protect our environment. I particularly welcome the positive role that China has played in delivering the Montreal Kunming Agreement on biodiversity. China has also been a driving force to reach a deal on the High Sea Treaty. This is particularly positive. So on the fight against climate change, we want to see China make concrete and ambitious commitments in the run-up for COP28 in Dubai. We discussed this topic too, and I invited China to jointly prepare this COP28 in the context of our joint initiative with Canada. And of course, I would very much welcome if China would be choosing to join the Global Methane Pledge. We need China as an important player. So these were the different topics in general that we have discussed, and I'm now looking forward to answer your questions.
Thank you very much. We need to have some time for questions. Anna. Yes, Mike will be coming.
Thank you. And Anna from Euronews. Madam President, I have a couple of questions, if I may. Have you received any reassurances from President Xi Jinping that he will not send weapons, lethal weapons, to Russia? And then yesterday, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken told Euronews, and I'm going to read it, that a Chinese move on Taiwan would literally hit every country on earth. And my question is, do you think that China is turning into a threat for the West and for Europe?
So, indeed, as I reported, raised the point of arms deliveries and I want to be very clear on that one, that arming the aggressor is a clear violation of international law. It's the aggressor, and he should never be armed. And this would indeed significantly harm the relationship between the European Union and China. On your second question, we all agree that stability in the Taiwan Strait is of paramount importance. We have a very clear interest in preserving this stability, the peace, and the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. And therefore, nobody should unilaterally change the status quo by force in this region. The threat to, or the use of force to change the status quo is unacceptable, and it is important that the tensions that might occur should be resolved through dialogue. And we have discussed these topics too. So both topics have been raised.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you for the height and welcome me here, Madam President. It's a journalist from Chinese media, and I would like to ask about the strategy autonomy. Yeah, because this
the what?
Yeah, the strategy autonomy, the concept of EU strategy autonomy. Because this concept has been usually referred and proposed by the Chinese side when it comes to the divergence, especially when the third-party factors happen in our bilateral relationship between EU and China. So I'm wondering, during the important meeting held today, do you have any opportunity to explain or interpret the genuine pursuit and the necessary principle of EU strategic autonomy to your Chinese counterpart?
Yeah. Since at least 2 years, we are very clear on our open strategic autonomy. This is a discussion that started during the pandemic, and when we felt the knock-on effects of several regions worldwide that shut down export of vital goods that were necessary to fight the pandemic, not the European Union. We discussed the open strategic autonomy in such a way that we said it is very clear for us that we stay open. We exported up to today 3.5 billion doses of vaccines. So this is a large number, and we were the only vaccine-producing region worldwide that never closed the border, but kept exporting, while we also were very vigilant to export as much as we delivered to the European people. But we felt, like many other regions of the world, that with the breakdown of, for example, supply chains, how vulnerable we were. The second element where the strategic autonomy was being felt heavily by the necessity for the strategic autonomy was being felt heavily by the European Union was with Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. As you know, just a year ago, there was a strong dependency of the European Union on Russian fossil fuels. And Russia used this dependency to blackmail us on the field of energy by cutting 80% of the pipeline gas supplied to the European Union within 8 months. This triggered a severe energy crisis, but we were able to withstand, and we were able to show that we do not give in to the blackmail. On the contrary, we completely diversified away from Russian fossil fuels. We invested massively in renewable energy that are homegrown and contribute to our European security and independence, but of course also to protect the climate. And the European people saved about 20% of their energy demand. And these are two examples that show that we want, with an open strategic autonomy, in a very clear European, individual European way, independent and sovereign, to define where we see risks, There we have to address them, where we need to strengthen our supply chains, for example, where we need to diversify our supply chains, and where we have to improve our position.
Yeah, thank you very much. The New York Times.
Madam President, is it realistic to think, in your opinion, as President Macron has suggested, that China might pressure Putin to end the war? And second, do you believe that China is trying to drive a wedge between Europe and the United States through its current studying of the US and charm offensive in Europe?
The transatlantic bonds are strong and founded on trust and a deep friendship since decades. And I was just referring to the critical situation we were in last year with cutting energy, the cuts of Russian gas supply. It were our friends, like for example the United States, that immediately stepped in with increasing the deliveries of LNG. So the transatlantic bonds are strong and they are based on not friendship, but they are also based on shared values. And this is a very important part that is unshakable. Then we discussed, and I raised the topic, I encouraged President Xi to reach out to President Zelensky. I know from my phone calls that, and President Zelensky asked for it publicly. So it was interesting to hear that President Xi reiterated his willingness to speak when conditions and time are right. I think this is a positive element. There was a third component in your question which I forgot. I must admit. No? Okay, thank you. It's late.
Yeah, thank you very much. South China Morning Post.
Thank you. I have two questions. We would like to know that President Xi gave a clear timeline to call Ukraine President Zelensky. And the second question is, you mentioned about the importance to focus on de-risking rather than decoupling. Did you raise this de-risking plan with President Xi, and what is your response to this? Thank you.
Yes, I think on the first question I just gave the answer. On the second question, indeed, it was very important for me to discuss with President Xi and of course also with Prime Minister Li that we think that de-risking is important, not decoupling. And with both, I discussed different examples where we see, for example, that de-risking is necessary. We also discussed, I must always put that in the same context, the other side of the coin that is for us the imbalances we see in the trade between the European Union and China. But one factor of discussion was indeed that de-risking is to be seen in the context that there are many goods and services in trade that are unrisky. Here the imbalances play a role, so we have to address them, but there are some goods that we see where we see that we have to de-risk, and that this is something we want to address, and therefore it's so important to have this high-level economic and trade dialogue to address specifically. There are specific asks from many companies from the European Union, very concrete cases, and this cannot be tackled in a leaders meeting, but it can and has to be tackled in a high-level meeting and high-level dialogue, and we want to address that directly.
Thank you very much. Der Spiegel. No? Okay. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Le Figaro.
Good evening. Just a question about President Putin announced his intention to do that. Have you raised that issue with President Xi, and what kind of answer he gave you on this? And more generally, how do you interpret the fact that Mr. Xi went to Moscow just a few weeks ago to reaffirm his support 1 year after the Ukraine war? Does that mean that actually the relationship between China and Russia is far more unshakable than the one you are trying to build with them? Thank you.
I raised indeed the topic in general of the nuclear arms threats, and specifically also our deep concern what the nuclear arms threats potentially based in or stationed in Belarus are concerned. So I was very clear on both. I think it is also visible in public statements in the peace plan that China put forward, and in public statements that China is strongly advocating against using, not only using nuclear weapons, but also not even using the threat of nuclear weapons. And this is a point where we absolutely agree on that one. Now you were asking about different meetings. China, being a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, has a big responsibility to use its influence in a friendship that is built on decades with Russia. And we count on China to really exert also this responsibility and to be very clear in the messaging.
Yeah, thank you. Last question, the Irish Times.
Thank you, Dennis Staunton from the Irish Times. Did you discuss the comprehensive agreement on investment in your meetings today? And is that agreement dead or alive? And secondly, just if you could just clarify exactly what role do you see China playing in finding a resolution to the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, I think I outlined strongly the responsibility that China has. We all have our responsibility, each and everyone in his or her place. But China, knowing Russia well and being a permanent member of the UN Security Council, has also a very distinct responsibility to use its influence on China for positive development. The comprehensive agreement on investment did not come up. You know our position. We started the negotiations around about 10 years ago, and we concluded the comprehensive agreement on investment around about 2 years ago. A lot has happened since then. The whole discussion that we have tonight here mirrors that. So we have seen also during that time a further deterioration of the market access I was describing of European companies in the Chinese market. So the lack of level playing field that we need. So our position is that we do have to reassess the comprehensive agreement on investment.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of this press conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.